wet. A year in the crosshairs of Watergate. A year. 1 year in L. Patrick Gray III's 88 years. The title alone makes me shudder. And then, strangely enough, the lyrics of a song from the show Rent begin in my head. 525,600 minutes. How do you measure a year in the life? And then I think, how do you measure a man? And how do you measure a man like L. Patrick Gray III, who was acting director of the FBI during Watergate? The White House's betrayal of Gray during Watergate and its aftermath was staggering, destructive, and disillusioning. Yet, upon reading this book, one can't help but acknowledge that even more important to Gray were fidelity, bravery, and integrity, which, by the way, is the FBI's motto. Add courage, honor, commitment, the U.S. Naval Academy's core values, and his for a lifetime, and we get a better idea of the lasting measure of this man, L. Patrick Gray III. In his memoir, he tells the truth about his year in the crosshairs of Watergate. L. Patrick Gray did not live to see this memoir published, but he wrote the book with his son, who saw the book through to completion and publication. We are honored to have him here with us today to talk about this historical and very personal book. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Ed Gray.
Thanks, Barbara. Nice. Well, thanks very much. That was, I think, so complete that I'll take questions now. Before I start with a small clip of a television interview I did on Friday morning on MSNBC, because it's such a really excellent introduction to what this book is, and the two hosts on the show asked a couple of questions that will make it easier for me afterward. I just want to tell you a little bit, very, very briefly, about how my father got to those 361 days that he sat in the director's chair in the FBI. And this is in the book, so you should just buy the book and maybe we'll skip over it. He was raised in Houston, Texas, born in St. Louis, but raised in Houston, Texas, graduated from high school when he was 16 years old after skipping a couple of grades. Went to Rice Institute, then now University. Went through 4 years of that program, was about to get his engineering degree, and he finally got the thing that he had wanted all his life, which was an appointment to the Naval Academy. So he left, don't know if that was me, but he left just before graduation. Never got his degree from Rice after 4.5 years. He was so insistent on getting to the Naval Academy on time, but he couldn't get there. His father had lost his job in the Depression. So he struck a deal with a Bulgarian shipmaster running an old tramp steamer out of Galveston, Texas. The deal was that my father would teach the master calculus while he rowed to Philadelphia on this ship, if the master would teach him the basics of ship navigation, because my father knew he'd need that in the Navy. And that's how he got to the Naval Academy. He got to Philadelphia. With that trade, he hitchhiked to the Naval Academy, made it in the nick of time, walked onto the football team, played for 4 years, graduated in 1940 just in time to go to war. His class in the Naval Academy suffered the highest number of casualties of any class in the history of the Academy. He himself did 5 war patrols in submarines in the Pacific. And he stayed in the Navy for a career. But at the end of the war, the Navy had a very competitive program to send line officers like he was to law school. He applied to that and was one of the very few men selected, and they were all men in those days, to go to law school. He went to George Washington University Law School in Washington, graduated at Order of the Coif near the top of his class, was on the law review, Juris Doctor. And while he was there, he met a freshman congressman named Richard Nixon. And they didn't stay in touch, but he knew him. And so in 1960, when my father came to his 20 years in the Naval Academy, and by then in the Naval Service, he was very high in the Naval Service, on his way toward getting a lot of stars. And he decided instead to leave the service after his 20 years and go to work for Richard Nixon, who was then the vice president, on the presumption that Nixon would win the 1960 election, which, as we all know, didn't happen. Jack Kennedy did. My father went back to his law practice, where he had a standing offer in Connecticut, and he did that until 1968, when Nixon did win the presidency, and my father got lured back into the government. And I'll show you in a minute the series of events that happened after that. But that is how he got into the Nixon administration. He had several jobs before he got to the FBI, including Assistant Attorney General, and he was the Deputy Attorney General designate prior to that. And while he was in that position, expecting to be the Deputy Attorney General of the United States, J. Edgar Hoover died. And Nixon, through the Attorney General, appointed my father the director of the FBI the day after Hoover died, and 6 weeks after that, the Watergate break-in happened. And that's the story that this book tells. My editor at Times Books, Paul Golub, a brilliant man, said that this book will only be a success if you do what your father didn't want to do. He didn't want to focus on Watergate. My father would have written a 900-page book that told you all of the substantive achievements he did in the government, and they were substantial. But instead, we have this book, and that's what we're going to talk about this afternoon. So if you want to roll that DVD, this will be a pretty good introduction to it.
It's great to have you with us this morning. It's a really interesting book, some calling it the final account of the Watergate story. I'm not sure if you'd agree with that. What are we learning in this book that we didn't already know about this story that's been dissected so much over the last 35 years?
Well, the fact that it's been dissected for so many years indicates that it's certainly not the last Watergate book. I mean, you know, it's a standalone category in the Library of Congress. There are professors in colleges who make an entire career of teaching Watergate. So it will go on, and some of the people who are involved still have not yet told their stories. But having said that, this is certainly the capper for the FBI's investigation. If anybody wants to know what the FBI knew and did not know during the course of the Watergate investigation, at least for the first year, then it's laid out in great detail with documentation in this book. There are two major things that are left unexplored by this book, and principal among them is the CIA's willingness to enter into the smoking gun plot. Specifically, Richard Helms, the director, and Vernon Walters, the deputy director of the CIA, got called in by Bob Haldeman a week after the break-in and said, hey, and it's all on the famous smoking gun tape, they said, we want you to go to Gray at the FBI and tell him to stop chasing the money into Mexico because that will uncover CIA assets. That was a flat lie. And both Walters and Helms knew it, yet they went along with it anyway, and they kept stopping the FBI's investigation. And there's an interagency agreement in place that allows them to do it, so that if the CIA comes to the FBI and says, stop here, or if the FBI goes to the CIA and says, hey, stop there, they just have to do it without asking any questions. It compartmentalizes the intelligence. So they use that tool to hinder the FBI's investigation, but only for a couple of weeks. Because the FBI, the guys actually working the case kept coming to my father and saying, hey, we need better reasons to stop here. And eventually my father demanded Vernon Walters, who was the deputy director and the acting director at that point, because Helms had kind of ducked out of the country. And he said, you got to give it to me in writing, and if you don't, we're going to go.
We should point out that you wrote this book in collaboration with your father, who's the former acting director of the FBI, directly involved in some ways, and at one point you stopped writing it.
Yeah, he actually, he wrote almost all of this book back in the 70s and the 80s with me working on it, and decided by the time he was free of all of the legal problems he had because so many people thought he was in on the cover-up, that he just put it away. And he told me that after I die, you can finish this thing and do what you want. But then, in '05, when the Vanity Fair article came out and identified Mark Felt as being deep throat, my father just hit the ceiling.
Because this was
boy.
his deputy director, as you told us
Number
earlier.
two guy.
This was a guy he'd been told over and over again by Mark Felt, I'm not the guy, I'm
Yeah,
not leaking
and my
information.
father had been ordered by the Attorney General, Dick Kleinde, several times to fire him, and my father refused to do it. Now all of a sudden he's identified as deep throat.
Well, Ed, we've got Pat Buchanan with us. We want to bring him in because he was in the Nixon White House for a time there. Pat, you want to jump in here?
Sure. I knew your dad, Ed. When I first knew about him was in the earlier 60s, when up in the New York office, when your father was very, very respected by Mr. Nixon as a very tough, capable administrator and executive. Did your father suspect Mark Felt was deep throat at times? And were you astonished that it came out? Because in the 90s was an article written, I think, in Harper's or one of those magazines, which rolled through all the names and came up with Mark Felt.
Yeah, of course, one of the names they rolled through was my dad. So
Right.
But my dad always knew from the get-go that deep throat could not have been one person. He said so. He had specific documented reason to know so. So that when the Mark Felt revelation came out, it outraged my father, because what it taught him wasn't that Mark Felt was deep throat, but that Mark Felt was part of deep throat. That he was one of Woodward's sources and one of Sandy Smith's sources at Time magazine and a variety of other people. So it truly outraged my father to think that his number two guy had lied to him and had leaked in violation of every code of ethics.
Well, let me ask you about the relationship of your father. He and the president obviously were very close at one time. The president had great confidence in him, put him in there to replace J. Edgar Hoover on his death. Did your father feel used by President Nixon or by Haldeman and the others? And was there any reconciliation between your father and President Nixon?
No, there was far from reconciliation. You know, my father was never really close to him. They had a professional relationship, but Nixon himself has said they never saw each other socially. Nixon said he was much closer to Hoover than he was to my father, but nevertheless, my father had great respect for Nixon. He was a loyalist in that regard. So that when all of this happened, when my father learned what Nixon had been doing behind his back, and when he finally heard those tapes, his view of Nixon went into the toilet. There's no other way to phrase it. He hated him thereafter. He would never take any of his telephone calls. He tried to return the books that Nixon would send him. Nixon kept trying to keep it open just as part of his own personal rehabilitation. But my father, I mean, I think he would have strangled him if he had been allowed to.
Okay, that's putting it
And
bluntly.
he said that himself.
Well,
Well, that's clarity.
that's clarity.
It's a remarkable story. I wish we had our entire show to get into it. There's
Yeah.
so many twists and turns and so many angles to cover, but people should really take a good read of this book.
Yeah,
It's
well,
called
they're all in the book. It
It's
tells
all in the
story
book.
quite
It's
well.
called In Nixon's Web. I was reading it last night. It's fascinating. It might change the way you...
I want to clarify one thing I said there. My brother Patrick reminded me that in reality, my father said several things about what he wanted to do to Nixon, most of which you're not going to hear from me tonight. But what he did say regularly, rather than the fact that he wanted to strangle him, what he said is that he wanted to get him alone in a dark closet with a baseball bat. And if you knew my father, that would have been a really bad deal for Richard Nixon. So, that's a brief introduction to the book. I want to try to explain a little bit more about how the book came about and why it took so long. And I'm going to start with that. This is by far the most complicated slide I'll show you tonight, I promise. And we may come back to it. But if you look at the maroon color up in there from 72 to 73, those are the 361 days between 1969 and 1981 that he spent in the FBI. The rest of the time after that was his resultant problems based upon the fact that prosecutors, reporters, congressmen, and virtually anybody else who had been paying attention assumed that he was one of the Watergate conspirators. partly because in 1974, early in 74, the Woodward and Bernstein book, All the President's Men, came out. And on the dust jacket of that book were 13 men, including Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was an unindicted co-conspirator from the grand juries. Every other person on that dust jacket either pled guilty or was convicted of a Watergate crime except my father. He was never even indicted. And yet, he was on the dust jacket. He's still listed as a conspirator on the website of the University of Texas, which houses Woodward and Bernstein's papers. And that alone, as much as anything else, drove all of those grand juries, all of those televised committees, and all of those prosecutors to assume in advance that this man was guilty and he must be lying about it. And it took him all of those years to clear his name. And he did clear his name. He got exonerated on the very last of these in December of 1980 in open court at the insistence of my father and his lawyers. And a few years later, he got a letter which is not in the book. It was a personal letter from one of the prosecutors, Frank Martin, who had been after him through everything you see up here, who finally apologized to him and his family in writing for having done so. He said, in effect in the letter, "You were innocent, we should have known it," and he offered his personal apology. My father, being the man he was, didn't show that letter to anybody. He didn't even show it to us.
Wow.
He just treasured it. And we found it very, very late in his life when the Deep Throat thing came out. So the time from 1973, when he left the FBI, until he finally was free of all of this stuff, had taken the bloom off the rose of a lot of the possibility of publishing a good Watergate book. Even though in 79, as things started to taper off, you can see he knew in 79 that he was innocent of this last charge associated with the Weatherman. And this is all described in great detail in the book. He and I started working on this book together because he thought it was going to be time. But they just kept delaying the exoneration and delaying the exoneration. And finally, by the time they did it, it was too late to do this book on a lot of levels, primarily the personal one I've talked about. He was just done with it, and we wanted him to be done with it. He needed to get on with his life, and he did, beautifully for many, many years. He went back to his law practice in Connecticut. Continued to practice as he moved progressively further south to Florida. Started practicing by FedEx, and he finally retired from his law practice and enjoyed a good long life to almost 89 years old. So this book exists now in this format because in 2005, when Vanity Fair identified Mark Felt, as I described on that clip, my father got mad and decided, he called me up and said, "Ed, we need to get back in the book business." So we did, and we started it. And 3 weeks after that, he got a late-stage pancreatic cancer diagnosis, and he was dead 3 weeks after that. So I made him a promise. And that promise is this book. So, but it's his words. 98% of the book is first person, L. Patrick Gray. We had this treasure trove of documents because he had all of these problems. Congressional committees, grand juries. Every time he testified, it was under oath, and if he had lied, he was going to get convicted and he was going to go to jail. And he knew it. And he said flat out, "I will never, ever." Anyway, it was just not in his makeup. He couldn't possibly lie under oath, and he did not. Consequently, he got away from it. But in order to defend himself, he had to write narratives for his lawyers. And his lawyers came in and said, "Hey, what happened?" He said, he didn't do what I'm doing right now. He didn't sit there and wave his arms and say. He very carefully wrote out, at the time, this is in 74, 75, 76, in great detail, what the FBI had been doing during Watergate and what he had been doing as its director. That is the book that you can read now. But it was fragmented, it was broken up. It was because he was answering specific accusations, he had specific problems, but he kept everything, including his individual notes whenever he took a telephone call. I mean, you can't imagine the extent of his documentation. Plus, when he was forced to defend the Watergate investigation, when he finally did get the nomination to be permanent director, and he had to go before the Senate Judiciary Committee, he knew they were going to ask him all about Watergate. So he went back to his people and said, okay, arm me with a full set of documents and a good understanding of the Watergate investigation, and they did. And because they made those copies, and then they would provide answers to his questions, those were his copies to keep under the then set of rules in Washington. The Presidential Records Act of '74 have changed those rules, and nobody can do that anymore, but then you could. Those were his copies, and he took them with him. So we have in a vault what is undoubtedly the most extensive set of documents related to Watergate outside the National Archives. And they're his, and we're going to make them public to anybody in the world who wants to see them. Someday we'll be able to look at them, compare them to this book, and so we'll stand on the record. So anyway, that's what I did with the book. When Paul Golub at Times Books decided to publish it, he said to me, Ed, your problem is paint by numbers. You have got all of these different elements everywhere, and this is the Irvin Committee hearings, that's blue, and this is the wiretap investigation, and that's red, and you have to put them together and put it together into perfect chronological sequence, and we're going to have to stick to those 361 days. So that's what we did, and I want to sort of walk through that a little bit now. We'll just focus on the Watergate thing for now. But as I said, he became acting director when J. Edgar Hoover died on May 3rd of 1972. He became the director. In June of '72, the Watergate burglars are caught. He's been on the job 6 weeks. So he just hands the investigation over to the pros. And they investigated from June to September, and this is all well described in the book. And eventually, in September of '72, the first round of burglars are indicted. The trial is coming. Everything seems to be going along, and nobody in the country thinks this is anything other than some people in the president's re-election committee or some zealots working for him who just went off the ranch. So as that transpired, my father got excellent press coverage. J. Edgar Hoover was one of the most hated guys in the country. This was a breath of fresh air. My father opened the windows. He hired young, bright attorneys to come in there as outsiders. He gave 1,000 press availabilities between May and January. That he would let anybody interview him on the record, and he did it. And as a result, the press was good. It was real good. This is in September. This is at his house in Stonington. That's a bunch of us in those days. And can a nice guy be head of the FBI? And now, since we're here in this library, you might be interested in some of the people up there. Maybe those. That's Betsy, my brother Alan, my brother Stephen. They can stand up and take a bow if you want to see how they look today, but I won't be. And then, just because I'm going to lean on all of my... And since I'm the guy who put the PowerPoint together, you're not seeing me there. So. But in any case, it was an election year. Nixon's re-election campaign was on. So, in October, CREEP is the Committee to Re-elect the President, one of the worst names ever, because I don't think they thought it down to the acronym level, and they're stuck with it forever. But and the CREEP was run by John Mitchell, the former Attorney General, who had been the Attorney General when my father was Assistant Attorney General. Mitchell quit in order to run Nixon's campaign. And ended up going to jail, like a lot of those guys. So as the election got closer, surprisingly enough, things started to appear in the paper. And on October 19th, Nixon gets told by Bob Haldeman that they found out who's been leaking all these documents out of the FBI. And it was captured on one of the infamous White House tapes. I'm going to play that tape for you, and it's going to be really, really hard to hear. But what I've done is I provided a transcript, so even though the sound quality is going to be horrendous, these were old reel-to-reel tape recorders, Uher 5000s if you're into it, and they were in the basement of the White House, and they were voice activated, and they clicked on it. So what you'll hear is the clicking of the tape reel as it goes while Haldeman is telling Nixon what they've learned. So, Nixon hears for the first time from his chief of staff, Bob Haldeman, that they have determined that Mark Felt is leaking. Now, this tape goes on, and there's another segment to it, but Haldeman was one of the very few people in the White House besides the president who knew that the tape system was in place. So he's hesitant on tape to tell Nixon who the source, how they find out. Nixon asks him, and Haldeman says, well, it's through a full circle, through a legal guide, a publication, but they just won't say who it is, but he says it's definite. And later in the conversation, trying to make this go. I'm not going to play this tape quite yet because I'm going to talk about the problem we have in understanding what was actually said on the Nixon White House tapes. This is the same conversation, and this is a transcript from Stanley Cutler's excellent book, where he just basically transcribed as many of the Nixon tapes as he could get. Stanley Cutler is a brilliant historian who filed the suit that got this stuff released. And this is what he says later on. Nixon asks Haldeman, what would you do with Felt? And Haldeman says, well, I asked Dean. And Nixon says, well, what the hell would he do? And Haldeman says, well, he says he can't prosecute him, he can't commit any crime. Dean's concerned if you know, he'll go out and go on network television. And Nixon says, oh, you know what I'd do with him, the bastard. Well, you know. So in this hearing of the tape, Nixon looks pretty weak and pathetic. And, you know, it's like, gee, what can I do? The bastard, you know. Well, in this process, since I'm in a library, I've got to give credit, you know. So, as I was putting this book together, I actually had many conversations with John Dean, who was my father's nemesis in this book, as you'll see. He's, as we all know, has rehabilitated himself pretty well. And early in the process, John Dean, who has listened to these tapes extensively, told me the trick to listening to them. You have to download them yourself. You have to get some software that can slow them down and play it at various speeds. And he pointed to this particular section in here. He said, go listen to that tape, because everybody says Nixon is calling Felt a bastard. And Dean told me that he said, I think he says ambassador. So think about that. And now I'll show you my transcription, and you can listen to the tape. can see how hard it is to get what they're going, and the archivists at the National Archives they think there are thousands of hours of these tapes. So if somebody as good as Stanley Cutler goes by one and gets it wrong, that's a great, honest mistake. But that's what he was saying. And what's fascinating about that is this is Nixon's plan to get rid of Mark Felt. And he never did it, but it's precisely what he did do to the director of the CIA, Richard Helms. A couple of months later, in January, he fired him and made him ambassador to Iran. So Nixon is far from helpless. He is a really strong, capable, devious character. And he has a plan. They just didn't, for one reason or another, go through with it. So, what happened in that, as a result of that revelation to Nixon that Mark Felt was lying, is that people went to Dick Kleindienst, who had been John Mitchell's replacement at the FBI, at the Justice Department, and said to him, "Tell Gray to fire this guy. You got to fire him. He's leaking." So 5 separate times, as outlined in the book, Kleindienst went to my father and said, "You got to fire Mark Felt." And each time, my father would go to Felt and say, "Hey, they say you're leaking. Are you leaking?" And Mark Felt, 32-year, number 2 guy in the FBI, said, "No, sir, it's not me. They're lying about me." And my father was faced with the choice of taking the word of a 32-year, high-ranking, completely respected senior FBI agent, or an anonymous, semi-anonymous tip from a reporter. But eventually, as it comes out in the book, he did find out who it was. But meanwhile, in '72, everybody has to remember, it wasn't just my father who thought Nixon was a good guy. Everybody thought he was a good guy. And in that election, remember, the Congress, both houses went Democrat, and Nixon won by that huge plurality anyway. So after that election, Nixon and Haldeman asked every cabinet-level officer to resign, including my father. So he just submitted it pro forma. At this point, the longtime FBI professionals, Mark Felt and a guy named Bill Sullivan and another guy named Deke DeLoach, who'd been out and wanted to come back, all up until then had assumed that my father was in there as a sort of a caretaker. He was the interim director, and eventually, after the election, once that was over, Nixon would take this temporary guy and put him back up in the Justice Department and name one of them to run the show. So my father put in his resignation, and Nixon didn't accept it. So now the guys inside the FBI begin to realize that Gray isn't temporary. He's going to stick around. He's their rival. And when that happened, they started leaking to the press like a colander. It was, and my father had no idea they were doing it. All he knew, as he was running the FBI and continuing to try to keep the windows open and talk to the press, that the press suddenly started putting things in their reports after talking to him and talking to other people that he knew to be false. And he could not figure out. It didn't even dawn on him that his own top guys were lying about him behind his back. What he thought is that these guys in the press were just agenda-laden and decided to write this story themselves. So he blamed it on the press, and it wasn't. So one of their great sources was a reporter who's now dead named Sandy Smith at Time magazine, and he was really in the pocket of some of these senior FBI guys, had been for a long time, and he wrote some really, really negative stuff, as you'll see in the book, about my father. And then, in January of '73, Nixon ratcheted up the problem for these FBI guys. He nominated my father to become the permanent director to replace J. Edgar Hoover. And when that happened, and it was officially in February, but these guys got wind of it in January, the leaks went bananas. And you remember the Parade magazine, kind of nice guy? How's that? And the article inside that magazine, my father, I have a copy of it in this archive, like vast numbers of other papers. My father took that 8-page, quadruple columned article and underlined all of the things that were wrong and wrote false and sent, pointed people to the doc, and it is littered with them. It's in the, it'll annoy you today, this many years later. So that was his problem. And this was just about the same time that he had to go before the Senate, the committee that was on the judiciary that was going to pass his nomination onto the full Senate for Senate approval. It was an advise and consent appointment. So this is one of my, I'm not really excellent with PowerPoint, but don't worry about the little red circles will make sense in a minute. But so if anybody knows how to do that, talk to me later. But anyway, so while Sandy Smith was doing this stuff, Bob Woodward was talking to people too. Now this is one of Bob Woodward's notes of one of his meetings with a source he named X on March 5th. And there's a whole bunch of stuff in there, but the part that's circled down there I want you to think about. I will talk about it because, if I could make this thing, there. This is the part that's circled. So this guy X on March 5th, which is during my father's confirmation hearings, is telling Bob Woodward that Bob Mardian, who was a guy in the Justice Department, headed a, quote, an out-of-channels vigilante squad of these are wiretaps. It's a very complicated story, but it's in the book, but they were basically illegal wiretaps. If you know this stuff, these are the famous Kissinger wiretaps that he put on newsmen and White House staffers. And this source is telling Woodward that it was this out-of-channels vigilante squad that did it. It was closely held knowledge, and Gray could deny it because his knowledge was out of channels. None of that is even vaguely true. The record is very clear now that those wiretaps were run under J. Edgar Hoover with full Justice Department approval, hidden approval, but it was all done through the chain of command. It was run by FBI agents in the building in the FBI. There was no vigilante squad. There was nothing out of channels. And so whoever this guy is, he's lying to Woodward. Nevertheless, he told him this, and then, because this is during my father's confirmation hearings, and that's the cover of the hearing book over there, and those are the dates. You see he was there starting on March 2nd, and he testified for a bunch of days past that March 5th. And here we are on the 21st of March. He's back again. And this is 635 pages into his hearing. It's just many, many hours. And he's being grilled by Ted Kennedy about this stuff. And here's the part that's under the... So here's what Kennedy says. In another area, Mr. Gray, have you heard the phrase out of channels and so on? Mr. Gray, no, sir. Kennedy, you have not heard the phrase out of channels? No, sir. Before you got in the FBI? No, sir, I did not. You're just not familiar with those words in any respect. That is correct. Workings either legitimate or illegitimate, that is correct. This is the kind of answer my father would give to these guys under oath. And you can see, it doesn't take any kind of a close reading to realize that Ted Kennedy does not believe him. No. Not even close. My father had never heard the phrase. But Kennedy clearly had gotten some kind of inside dope the same way Woodward had from somebody who's lying about him. So, another one of them, whatever. Bob Woodward attended these hearings. And you can get his notes now. And while he was there, he obviously heard that answer. So he went back to another source. Now here we are. Now we're on March 24th. And he goes to some other guy, and he asks him a bunch of questions, and he gets this answer. Well, let me go back. I thought I had my slides all wrong there. So this guy on March 24 says, doesn't know about the term out of channels, but says that the tappers included some present and former FBI agents. And then Woodward says, my source insists absolutely all were former agents. This guy, whoever was this on March 24th, was considerably more knowledgeable than that guy X back on the 5th. But he's still a little bit off, but it's a little bit more knowledgeable. So I just want you to keep this little set of tapes in mind as we take another step here. In 2003, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein sold their papers to the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas for $5 million. I don't know why they did that, but as part of the deal, Woodward said that he was going to withhold his notes of all of his secret sources who were still alive. Because the Texas right to know laws are really, really open. And once something is in the state of Texas, any citizen can go take a look at it. So they're not there yet. But he promised that especially Deep Throat, that's obviously why they paid the $5 million, when he died or was identified, Woodward would come up with the papers. So Vanity Fair identified Mark Felt as Deep Throat in May '05. Texas announced, and I know these people, I've been down there, announced that Woodward would deposit his Deep Throat notes a little bit later that fall. I was really looking forward to seeing those papers. At this point, I'm working on my book. Woodward stalled for a year and a half. No notes. There are 17 meetings in All the President's Men between Woodward and Deep Throat, and for a year and a half, not one of them appears at the University of Texas, where he's under a $5 million obligation to produce the paper. Finally, in '07, he deposited what he claimed were his Deep Throat notes. 4 out of 17 are in the collection. He says, when you press him, and I've talked to him at length, that the other ones are not there yet because there are other names in them and he can't release them yet. That's his current cover story. So, the 4 meetings that he has deposited notes for are October 9th, January 24th, that's the one we saw back there, and then the 2 that are very interesting, the March 5th and the March 24th. And when he deposited these, I had already been down there and I looked around, and I realized that March 24th tape, that interview that he had deposited, was one I had already seen. It was already there. His notes were typed on 5-ply carbon, and one of the carbons had been deposited in his notes that were associated with an interview with a guy named Donald Santarelli. Donald Santarelli had been a medium-level official in the Justice Department and then led the LEAA, and is currently practicing law in Connecticut. In Washington. So I knew him by name. I'd never talked to him. So when I read the notes, and the March 24th is the one where he says doesn't know about the term out of channels. So I called him up and I said, hey, I got some of your notes of a conversation you had with Bob Woodward. Did you have conversations with Woodward? He said, oh yeah, sure, I talk to him all the time. And so I said, can I send you these notes? And we talk about him. He said, sure. So I sent them to him, and 10 days later he called me back and he said, yeah, that was me. I was talking to Woodward about that stuff. And I said, what about that out of channel? He said, I don't really know. He said, I was never briefed on the Kissinger taps, but I just was in the building. I got this through osmosis, and so I told Woodward what I knew. So now but Woodward had deposited these notes as notes of conversations he had with Mark Felt. It couldn't possibly be, so I called Woodward. I said, hey, there seems to be some sort of an internal conflict here. And I actually sent, he had his own copies. So we talked about this internal conflict. So here we are. On March 5th, this is what that Deep Throat guy named X said. Marty and headed and out of channels, blah, blah, we've just had that. So then, but on March 24th, when Woodward goes back there after hearing the Kennedy thing, saying, wait, what is this? Deep Throat says, doesn't know about the term out of channels, never heard of it. So I said to Bob, he's on the phone, and he's like, I said, yeah, I see the internal inconsistency, but no, those were both conversations I had with Mark Felt that I just can't explain why they're not. And what I did not tell Bob is that I had already had confirmation from Don Santarelli that was him. So now that's in the book. The book's out as of this week. I have not heard from either one of those guys, but you may be hearing more. Because Don Santarelli is a very well-respected Washington lawyer, still in practice. And he told me that was him. And Bob Woodward said, no, that's Mark Felt. In the book, you'll see several other pieces of evidence that are equally as convincing as this, that Woodward has not yet fully told us the truth about Deep Throat. It's clearly a composite, just as my father always insisted it was. And it's, you know, the thing that drove me to this, as you'll see in the book, is that there is a complete fabrication about my father in that book, All the President's Men, associated with a claim that Deep Throat made that my father blackmailed Nixon into appointing him the director. And that's completely false. In the legal review of the book, just before it got published, Woodward decided, or was told he had to call Steve Sachs, my father's lawyer. Steve Sachs called my father and then reported back to Woodward that that was a complete fabrication, that was a lie, that was wrong. And Woodward and Bernstein did not change that passage in the book. What they did is put one of the very few footnotes in the book. And in that footnote it says that Pat Graves' lawyer, Steve Sachs, vehemently denies this. But he didn't change it. And so my father, knowing that, knew that that book was a piece of fiction. So he never read it. He always said, I wanted to read the books that meant something. So, but I did, and I didn't like it. And but this is what my father always said, that Deep Throat had to be a composite just based because no one person could know all that stuff. This book proves it. We've had legal review. You can imagine the publisher wasn't about to publish this thing if it didn't work, and it does. And what we know now about Deep Throat is this. Certainly Mark Felt was a source. No question about Mark Felt's family says it. Woodward has said it. It appears that one of the other sets of notes that Nixon deposited, that one on January 24th, looks to me very much like Mark Felt talking. He's restrained. He doesn't say some of the stuff that's completely baloney. But it's a completely different voice. So certainly Mark Felt is one. Donald Santarelli is certainly one. His papers are down there in the thing. And he told me himself that those were notes of his conversation with Woodward's, not Mark Felt's. One of the other guys in there, and this isn't covered in the book, but it's part and parcel of the CIA cover-up problem, which is a big part of the book. Senator Robert Bennett was working for the CIA in those days. It was long before he got elected to the Senate from Utah. And he ran the CIA cover company that hired and employed Howard Hunt, and so he was deeply involved in it. And he, in a document that has long since been pulled out of the CIA through the Freedom of Information Act, and against which Bennett himself has testified under oath that it's true, he is bragging to his handler at the CIA that he has been feeding information to Bob Woodward, goes into some detail, and says that Bob Woodward is suitably grateful. So, and his profile fits. So we know from Bennett's own testimony and that he was one of the guys. And then we have this guy X, who is described in the book. We don't know who the one who fed those complete pack of lies about the Out of Channels Vigilante Squad. At this point, I have no idea who that is. There are some real good candidates. Almost certainly it's somebody still alive. And you can make your own guesses about that guy, but it's definitely not Mark Felt, because for reasons that are complicated but easy to understand when you read the book. He could not have been Mark Felt. He was not Don Santarelli, because this guy was talking out of channels and Santarelli didn't know what that was. Might have been Bennett. I don't think so. I think it's somebody else. So there are at least 4. And that's pretty much what I want to talk about tonight. There's so many more things that my father had to deal with that we had to pack into this relatively short book. The Wounded Knee, Uprising happened in the middle of those confirmation hearings while he was being grilled. He had to try to keep alive his agents and try to prevent an armed insurrection. That was fascinating. He had some serious terrorist issues with al-Fatah, which are described in detail for the first time in this book. So it's all this convoluted, difficult story that he had to face, but And it all took 361 days of his life. And he spent the next 8 years, and really the rest of his life, trying to overcome the false impression that the world had about him, because he was forced to keep his own counsel publicly, while at the same time talking in great, vast, endless, documented detail under oath to grand juries and Senate and House committees. So the record of what he knew to be true is on the record, and it's what underlies what's in this book. So if you want to take and get an understanding of what it's like to be an honest, honorable, very intelligent, forthright human being thrown into this cauldron, then it's probably worth it for that. So having said that, I'll stop talking.
You've made an excellent, compelling case for why the Deep Throat character had to be comprised of at least 2, 3, possibly 4 entities that Carl Bernstein, yet he's probably not apologized to you for sort of blurring the facts. How did your father ultimately get exonerated, or will I miss the whole best part of the book?
Well, he got exonerated because... Oh, I'm sorry. The question was, how did my father get exonerated from all of the accusations against him? And the answer was just through hard legal work backed up by documents. He answered every single question. He never refused to cooperate. And because he had that trove of documents that he took with him, the 2 of my brothers went back and retrieved from the Justice Department after my father resigned in April. He not only could tell the truth, but he could back up the truth. So when the prosecutors who really wanted to indict him, especially for what they said was perjury about those wiretaps at the Kennedy questions, he had so much documentation that they couldn't even indict him. So that's how he did. He did it with facts, perseverance, incredible expensive, and 2 brilliant lawyers, Steve Sachs and Alan Barron, both of whom are around today. Steve Sachs went on to be twice elected Attorney General of Maryland. He's a super liberal Democrat, and currently an Obama guy, by the way. But anyway, he's brilliant.
I'm just on page 2.
It gets way better.
And it says, word of Senator Lowell Weiker's selected leaks was out. What goes after that?
Well, Lowell Weicker was still is, a great friend of the family, and was a great friend of my dad's. And was his supporter, was the man who put his name in, one of the 2 senators from Connecticut, put his name into nomination to be permanent director of the FBI. So when my father had to admit, and it's a very complicated story, but it's all in the book in great detail, that he had destroyed some documents that had been in Howard Hunt's safe, that had been given to him in confidence by John Ehrlichman and John Dean in the White House very early in the Watergate situation, long before there was any hint that somebody in the White House was involved. They had given him these papers and said, "We've already turned over all the Watergate stuff to your agents. These are political dynamite, top security documents that cannot see the light of day." My father assumed that meant they were to be destroyed, and he had lots of experience dealing with national security secrets. So he assumed that, under what he called the presumption of regularity, that these top guys were handing him something that should be dealt with only at that level of trust, at the highest level. So he did, and he destroyed them. And then later, when John Dean started to feel the heat, primarily from my father putting his name in front of the world at the hearings, that John Dean, in order to try to save himself, passed this gem, what he thought was a gem, along to the prosecutor, saying, well, Pat Gray destroyed some documents. So my father at first denied it internally. And then he had to fess up to it, and he was still trying to decide whether he could remain the director of the FBI if he'd done this thing, because he couldn't explain it in great detail because it just had to do with national security. And while that was happening, he decided he better tell Lowell Weicker, who was his great friend, and who had nominated and had placed all this great faith and trust in him. So he called Lowell Weicker over and he said, "Can you come over to the office tomorrow? It's going to take a little while." And so Lowell came over, and my father laid out for him the whole story and why he had done it. Lowell thought about that, and the next day he came into my father and he said, "Pat, you're probably going to hate me for this, but I've done this in your best interest. I've leaked this story to 5 selected reporters that I know." And sure enough, it hit all the papers that night. And my father, with that kind of PR, overnight there wasn't any question about it. He could no longer be the director of the FBI. He was going to have to step away because there were too many other issues. So, So my father did. The next day, resigned as acting director and went back into private life and started defending himself. And 3 days after that, Nixon fired Haldeman, Ehrlichman, the Attorney General Dick Kleindienst, and maybe 1 or 2 other people. And what Lowell had heard through the grapevine was that Nixon was planning to do this. And he wanted to prevent my father from being wrapped up in the same package with these true conspirators. Wow. So what Lowell had done was unbelievably sensitive, careful, well thought out, difficult decision of a true friend. He leaked that stuff, knowing my father wouldn't do it, so that he knew my father would be forced to resign, and so that he could resign rather than be fired. So that's the essence of that chapter. Yeah.
Hi. You mentioned Richard Helms. He was a holdover from the Johnson administration, and from what I understand, you really had no friendship or love for Richard Nixon as a whole. So what would his motivation be to cover up or ask the FBI to stop the investigation?
It's probably the single best unanswered question in Watergate. He was a holdover from long before Johnson. Richard Helms had been in the CIA since its inception, and he had been its director since, I forget when, certainly before Johnson. And he was obviously no Nixon lover. But the CIA has always had a relationship that none of us can possibly know with presidents of the United States. They've got I don't know if you've read Tim Weiner's Legacy of Ashes, but if you haven't, you should. Even though he gets this aspect wrong. He does. But the rest of it's pretty good. It is such a great question. Why would this guy, who was as secretive and knowledgeable and careful and experienced, go along with this smoking? Why could he allow himself to be called over to the White House and told to lie to the director of the FBI? What my father always said is that in the intelligence services and in the high levels of the military, there are certainly great reasons to dissemble to the public. Winston Churchill's bodyguard of lies. The truth is so precious, she must always be protected by a bodyguard of lies. But what my father said is, you do not do that to each other at the highest levels. It's okay for the director of the CIA to maybe tell a lie about what they're really doing somewhere in this dangerous world we live in. But it's not okay for that guy to directly lie in private to the director of the FBI, which is precisely what he did. And there's no answer for that yet. Someone should look into it.
And thank you for sharing this great experience with us. Are there any lessons, takeaway lessons to be learned about, how the FBI really works and how the CIA really works and how senators really work? And, that could be relevant for us today, here, going forward. There seems so much black magic in it all.
Yeah, I think every lesson that my father learned the hard way should go forward for the rest of us. And it's black, but it's not magic. You know, it's just hidden. It's venal. It's small. It's political. It's self-serving. You know, at the worst levels. You know, and then at the other levels, you know, the patriotic zealots, and that guy at the top of that dust jacket is one of them. He really believed that everything he did was something that was for the good of this country that had made him what he was. You know, he fought for it in 2 wars. He had to hitchhike to the Naval Academy. He started with 0. And he got up to the highest levels of the government. He loved this country. And he couldn't believe that the selection process that he had grown up with in the United States Navy would allow for people who weren't like him, at least in their attitude toward what your responsibilities were toward the American people. It just didn't dawn on him that the system didn't winnow out the liars, the creeps, and all the rest of it. And he was wrong. What he didn't realize is that in the FBI, Hoover had set up a system that wasn't hierarchical, it wasn't competitive, it was political. You know, those guys, Mark Felt and those other guys who worked in the FBI, were politicians. They hadn't been out in the field for 30 years. What they knew how to do was save their butts working for J. Edgar Hoover. And that was not an easy thing to do. But it was extremely political and Machiavellian, backbiting, difficult, and nasty. And that's the kind of character that J. Edgar Hoover allowed and to prosper. So one of the great lessons, you know, maybe the greatest lesson, is that you cannot let somebody get control of a couple of the black departments of the government. The CIA, the FBI, the NSA, Defense Intelligence Agency, there's a bunch of them. You cannot let somebody get in there and run it without oversight. Because horrible things happen, as we are learning today. That's what I think you take away. Betsy.
And just share with everybody, though, that on another level of the FBI, how much they loved your dad, the FBI agents.
Yeah, that's a good. I'm glad you brought that up. You know, because much as those guys at in what Hoover called SOG, the seat of government, you know, the Felts were nasty. The field agents were just the opposite. You know, they were what my father discovered, and he went and visited every single field office in the FBI, 50 some odd of them, except for Hawaii, because my mom was born in Hawaii, and he didn't want somebody to think he was taking her on a junket. So, true story. It's the only reason he didn't go there. And but he got to know these field agents, and they got to know him. And he loved those. Now, he saw in the field agents, from the special agent in charge of a field office down, the type of people that he had served with in the Navy. You know, willing to risk everything, patriotic, schooled, disciplined, all of those things. And so he immediately initiated, you know, a change in that policy. He got rid of a couple of departments in the FBI. He told all those senior guys that, you know, they were going to get sent out to be special agents in charge or assistant directors in charge, and he was going to bring in super promising guys from the field, and he started that process, which exists today, as my brother will tell you, because he did 20 years in the FBI after this. And
can I just say something?
Yeah, please do.
I'm Patrick Gray. I'm another Gray. We got a few of them here today, and I did 20 years in the FBI. And one of the things that my father started as soon as he got to the FBI was the Office of Planning, Evaluations, and Administration, which is now our inspection division. So as soon as he came on board, he brought in a group to do the internal inspections to make sure that the rank and file agents are doing what they were supposed to be doing. And those of us in the field have no idea about the machinations that occur within the Beltway. I don't think we probably do want to know all those machinations that occur in there, but having served at the CIA and the National Security Administration, being seconded by the FBI to both of those agencies, I will tell you first and foremost that the rank and file of these agents, they're dedicated, they're determined, and they do what's right. They're really good. And unfortunately, my father was an honorable man, and he was put in a situation where he wasn't dealing with honorable men. But every man and woman who works at the FBI, the CIA, and the NSA today, they're just absolutely incredible people, and they work for us. Looking at my dad's service to his government, I look at my brother Alan and my brother Ed. Alan and I are both Vietnam Marines. Ed was a naval officer. I've got a son who is a second lieutenant in the Marine Corps. My nephew Malcolm right here just came back from tours in Afghanistan and Iraq with the Marine Corps. So we are a family that's deeply entrenched in serving our government. And I just want to thank Ed for all that he's done to bring my dad up. Thank you very much.
I'm sorry that your dad had to go through all this during the Watergate era, but I do admire what you all have done as a family to rehabilitate him. However, on a different note, I'd like to ask you, why after 33 years, this fascination still for Watergate? I mean, it's a very positive. I'm not trying to be critical, but I just want to be very positive.
Oh.
Why still? Because in a country where news flies, week to week, or maybe day to day, or minute to minute, this is still a thing on in this nation since 74.
Mm-hmm.
It's been almost 44
Yes.
years, and people are still so fascinated. Everybody's here for this information,
Yeah.
more information on Watergate.
It's a great question. I think there's, of course, there's as many answers as there are books, but there's two basic ones. One is that Richard Nixon is the only sitting president ever forced to resign. And he was forced to resign because of some really small time problems. If you go back and look at what his dirty tricks guys were doing in his campaign compared to what some of those guys are doing today, they were saints, but nevertheless, he didn't even want that to come out. So he got involved in a criminal cover-up, and he got involved in obstruction of justice, and he had to leave. That's endlessly fascinating. And then the other aspect is that it was all taped, and we have the tapes. So we can go in there and listen in a soap operatic fashion to these guys talking at a level that you and I wouldn't do. Either whether it's the language or the pettiness or sometimes a really crummy plan. It's just amazing that these people who are in the highest levels of government, and they were trying to extricate the United States from Vietnam, they were opening the door to China, they were dealing with interesting and difficult civil rights issues, and these are the guys who are in charge of doing that. Yet it's always fascinating to people to be able to look at these people and see what they're saying in these unguarded moments and realize how small-time, venal, and petty they are. I don't think that'll ever go away, and we may never see that again because no one's going to let their tapes out again. I promise you. That's not happening. Yeah. Barbara.
Thank you, and thank you, Brother Patrick, for sharing some of the family with us. I wonder if you would, I don't know if this is covered in the book or not, if you would speak a little on what it was like as members of the family when all of this scandal was going on with your dad and with the government. And I'm not sure what your age was at the time, but how was it affecting the family?
Well, it affected us all differently, of course. In my case, I was working as an auditor at Price Waterhouse in Boston, actually. And so I had a job there, and it started off pretty cool. When my dad got placed in the job after Hoover died, I got a call from a guy who was the special agent in charge of the Boston office. I was at work at Price Waterhouse, and he identified himself and said he wanted to talk to me about security for the family, because Hoover had no family. They had to deal with this, and all my brothers had the same experience and their families. And so I said, can I call you back? And he said, yeah, I'll give you my number. I said, no, don't give me your number. And I let him hang up, and I looked up his number in the phone book. And I called him back, and I said, this is Ed Gray. He said, we don't have any problem with you. So it started off pretty well. But then, we knew Watergate. We knew it was tough. And my dad, he just didn't talk about it. He didn't talk about the things he knew in the Navy. He was one of the very, very, very few people in the U.S. government who knew about the overflights of the U-2s, including the one that Francis Gary Powers got shot down, and he knew in advance that was going, and when the cover story broke, we didn't see him for 10 days, so we had no idea what he was doing. So that was all very private. And then I do remember very distinctly getting a call, and I think each of my brothers got the same call the night that Lowell Weicker leaked the story. And my dad called me up, and I'm sure he's had the same call with each of the other three brothers and their families, and he said, there's going to be some very rough news in the paper tomorrow. He said, I just want you to know that it's choreographed, he hoped, and that it's part of a plan, and don't take it completely at face value. So that was the first we had heard of how difficult it was. And then, we rode with him through all those years and years and years of dealing with the grand juries and all that stuff while trying to run his law practice. And so we would go, just like that picture you saw in Stonington, we'd go back to that house and we'd do that stuff, and then he moved to some other houses. And so our family life, I don't want to say it was unaffected by it, but it was unaffected by it. It was, we continued to be very, very close. We didn't go there and say, gee, Dad, tell us about your problems. We didn't. We allowed him to dump those problems for a time and enjoy his kids and his grandchildren. And he was just wonderful with kids. So in that regard, it was pretty good. Although when he did finally get indicted, which is all laid out in the book on this weatherman black bag, this false indictment that should not have happened, we all went down to Washington with him for that. And we marched essentially arm in arm with him to the courthouse and stood by him while they fingerprinted him. And then, but we never, none of us, not even for a split second, ever knew anything but the truth, was that this was a man who was much maligned, and someday the true story was going to come out. And it's hard to describe, but it was a fairly normal family life apart from these horrible problems he had. Partly because he just shut up about it. He wouldn't let any reporters in, so he wasn't talking about it, and we all knew enough if some reporter tried to backdoor through one of us to get to one of those, to my dad or mom, we knew enough just to hang up. So we weren't affected by it much.
Hey, Ed. Becky says I should share this story.
Yeah, you do have to tell your story.
I don't remember what year it was, but it was sometime in the late 70s when Nixon was still trying to reconcile with my father-in-law. We were up in Stonington, and the phone rang, and I answered it, and it was a secretary type saying, I had President Richard Nixon on the phone for L. Patrick Gray. So I looked at Pat across the room, and I said, and he said, so I said, I'm sorry, but Pat Gray can't come to the phone. And then the secretary said, well, just a moment. So all of a sudden I hear, this is Richard Nixon. And I said, well, this is Betsy Gray, the daughter-in-law. And we had about 2 or 3 sentences, how's your father-in-law doing or whatever. And I was being given a stare by Pat, so I didn't say very much. But it's kind of funny in the family because there were other daughters-in-law. But, just let me know that I was the daughter-in-law. But just to say what Ed said, what gave Pat the most joy was his family. Every time we had gatherings, every time we gave him a call and said another grandchild was on the way, or a child and then grandchildren, he was a happy family man.
Here. One of my greatest takeaways is you document everything you do. That's the biggest thing for him. We would get in his car to the day he died. He kept a little journal in his car, and he was very fastidious about this. Every time we got in the car, he got in the car, he would write down the date, the time, where we were going, the ending mileage, and if we bought gas, he put down how much it cost. So when Ed talks about the notes, you don't know notes. We have got an archive that I don't think the University of Texas can handle. I mean, this guy was so good. So the lesson to you folks is document everything. You think the government's looking at you. That's all you can do.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I have just, oh, go ahead.
Just a quick question. Are you planning to do a CD on this?
Yes, there's an audio book in the works.
Oh, good.
And in fact, I'm glad you brought that up. It should be out in early April. You can see it on Amazon now. It's been recorded, but they asked me to provide some supplemental materials for it. So I gave them some tapes like these, some other ones, some White House tapes, and I also gave them 4 or 5 segments of the recordings that my wife Becky and I made in '79 when we were talking to my dad about putting this book together. And we were asking him the questions like his lawyers did. And he told us about Hoover's secret files and what he thought of Vernon Walters. And, he said, I'll let you hear it on the so you'll hear my father talking about this book and what he wanted to say. And you'll hear Becky and me asking him questions and seeming a lot less knowledgeable than we are now. So yeah, it's coming out pretty soon.
I was wondering about Henry Kissinger, because he seemed very unscathed by the Watergate period. And I was wondering if you had any dialogue or any interaction with Henry Kissinger, because he seemed to come through this pretty clean. From my experience, maybe in the book it's different.
It's certainly not in the book. My father had very little interaction with Henry Kissinger. Kissinger was running the national security shop in the White House. My father was running the FBI after Hoover, and the internal argument between the various security agencies had already happened while Hoover was still alive in the last year of his life. The famous Houston plan, if you're a junkie on this stuff, and it was where the Nixon White House tried to pull together all of the intelligence agencies and get them to work against what they were worried about, these domestic subversives. They were convinced that they were getting funding and other training from outside the country. Therefore, that would allow the CIA to come in and do domestic stuff in violation of its charter. And all of that argument had happened and had been solved, much to Nixon's dismay, by having the FBI say, we don't want any part of it. One of the interesting decisions that Hoover made. So he had very little truck with Kissinger. But, what you said about Kissinger having escaped easily, that's probably not over. Because one of the prime candidates for X up there is Alexander Haig. Al Haig was Kissinger's number 2 guy, and then he became, and some of the tapes you'll hear on that audio version are Nixon and Al Haig talking about Mark Feld. So it's good stuff.
Thank you, Ed.
Yeah, thanks.
The name of the book, In Nixon's Web, A Year in the Crosshairs of Watergate, L. Patrick Gray III and Ed Gray. Please join us for a reception in the magazine room. Thank you.